Good morning again. I am delighted to moderate this panel of our respondents. I am going to take a moment and let each of them introduce themselves very briefly, both who they are, their institution, and what their role is in the work that we're discussing in terms of connecting colleges and communities for the opportunities that we can make available to young people who deserve them. So may I start with Carol?
Good morning. I'm Carol Van Atten. I'm the Vice President at the Charles Hayden Foundation, and we support programs in New York City and Boston. And there are many of our grantees here: Skidmore, HEAF, SEO. I think I saw Legal Outreach earlier, and there's probably more of you that Cypress Hills, who's about to join us. And I, first of all, just really want to thank all of you who are in the room doing the real work of helping young people, urban people, low-income and first-generation people get to and through college.
Hi everyone, I'm Deb Shaver. I'm the Dean of Admission at Smith College. I've been in admission for 36 years. I started when I was 10. And have mainly worked at institutions that were highly selective. I've been at Smith for 23 years. So, we talk about kids finding their match in college. I have found my match professionally, and Smith is a place that really supports first-generation low-income students. I myself was first-generation low-income. My husband is first-generation low-income. So you are my people, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing for kids. You really make a true difference in the lives of children, kids.
Thank you. As full disclosure, I am both the executive director of PACE. I am also a trustee of Smith College, where I'm
a lot of pressure, a lot of pressure.
We love having you here, Deb. Talk just a moment, each of you, before we get to really reflections on what we've heard and what resonated, just briefly about partnerships that you've experienced and from your different seats, if you will, and how that just sort of some thoughts, I guess, on your own personal experience, either in creating or funding or helping partnerships, and if there's any thoughts on that. And Deb, if there are particular partnerships that you can point to from the admissions perspective.
You want me to start?
Go ahead.
Partnerships with community-based organizations are very important to me as a dean of admission. Admission officers are very pragmatic. Right? I mean, we talked a lot about sort of high philosophical ideals this morning, especially starting with the presidents. We are very practical in admission offices because we have very clear goals. You might be shocked to learn that I work for an ambitious president and an ambitious board. They all are. You can laugh a little. And so, my president every year says to me, are you going to get me another record number of applications? Are you going to lower the admit rate? What are you going to be the diversity statistics of the class? Are we going to have more students of color? What do the first gen numbers look like? What do the Pell Grant numbers look like? And so we are sort of at the intersection of all this sort of the moral responsibility we have to educate all kids, right? And how are we going to do it in a really practical sense? And so when I became the dean at Smith, it was a requirement when my staff went out and recruited that they recruit at a certain number of high schools each week that had high populations of students of color and high populations of first-generation low-income students. Right? No matter where you were required to visit a certain number of those high schools. And frankly, it wasn't working. It wasn't working. I would go to a high school and I would see the three students would come down to see me as the dean of admission, and they would be the three students who were not first gen or low income in that particular high school. And so what we found was that we had a few partnerships with some community-based organizations, and guess what? They were working. And they were working because you who work there know your students, and you are the pathway to college. When I graduated from college, I became certified in guidance, which is now called school counseling, and there were no courses in the graduate programs, and this is true across the country, where you took a course in college counseling. Right. So school counselors are often unequipped to do the college counseling that community-based organizations are doing. And you also identify, I know that there was some concern about using the word talent, but identifying talent for us, right? And and shepherding those students in the direction of the highly selective institutions in places like Smith. Smith's mission is to educate women of promise for lives of distinction. So instead of using maybe the word talent, I would say, women of promise. And so you have the partnerships that we've formed with CBOs, and we communicate regularly with about 450 community-based organizations and agencies, and we've partnered with about 30. But in terms of a sustainable model, these are the organizations that are providing us year after year with really wonderful applicants, and who then encourage those students to enroll at a place like Smith, and then, very importantly, you follow those students through Smith, so together we can work on making sure that they persist and graduate.
Thank you. Carol?
Does
We'll come
Lawrence
back
wanna-
around. No,
Okay.
it's good. Lauren's catch up.
Well, I think Desiree
catch up.
mentioned that foundations are very good at convening people and getting people together. I used to do development work, and I always say people return your calls a lot faster when you're giving out money than when you're asking for it. So usually if we make calls, people will show up in a room. But I think the other point that we've realized is that foundations particularly have to be flexible. That sometimes we start out with these grandiose ideas of what's going to work, and to the point that the women from Brooklyn College and Canada spoke about, things can change. You are working with people, and you're working with young people, and I think sometimes we forget how complicated their lives can be, and I think it's very important when you're working and collaborating to be flexible to whatever role that you're coming into that collaboration with, to have open communication. Don't wait until it's all falling apart. The minute something starts to not go as well as you thought, pick up a phone, talk to the funder or talk to your other partners, and just make sure that there is open communication and the ability to be flexible. And we try to do that as well on our side.
Thank you. Lawrence, can you introduce yourself and then just a real basic on what Cypress Hills does in terms of partnerships?
I can handle that. Hi, everybody. I'm Lawrence Louie, Director of College Success Program, Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation. So just to give you a brief overview, we're a 34-year-old community-based organization. We fashion ourselves like a settlement house. So we do kind of a comprehensive suite of services: affordable housing, community development, advocacy work, organizing. We do after school, we do childcare, we do college success programming, and of course we do workforce development. So what my charge is really looking at early awareness programming, access programming, and persistence programming until folks graduate from college. And so we really start at the 9th grade level. With our high school partners. We work with about 10,000 residents, but in our program specifically, College Success, about 800 students are enrolled in college right now on a persistence end. But we have about 7 partner high schools that we work with, one of which, in terms of the site, 5 of those high schools are co-located. So just to kind of give you a scope of shared campus and where the actual work is happening, and then also kind of the competing priority sometimes of partners and principals, just to kind of give you some scope there. And then, what was the other piece?
Just our thoughts on what the current partnerships you have with
So,
higher ed?
yeah, so in terms of higher ed, and I'll kind of shift to the persistence piece. So we have about 800 students that are enrolled. We really expanded our work in 2012 around persistence, and we feed directly from our high school partners, our high school sites, because, just to give you some scope, 2/3 of our students go to CUNY schools, and within those 2/3, about half go to community colleges. We really saw that a lot of our students were just going locally, and we had to really kind of change the conversation around when a student goes to BMCC, what does that mean? That's not a failure. That's an opportunity, and that's something to be celebrated. So BMCC, City Tech, Kingsborough Community College, and actually, to a certain extent, Queensborough, we've all partnered in some capacity with those schools. LaGuardia was actually a big partner as well. But I'd say the biggest high-yield schools were BMCC, City Tech, and LaGuardia. We have formal relationships with them. And one of the big things that we saw was you have to be really clear of what you want and what your actual values are. I think, just kind of hearing all the conversation, all the really, I think, critical points that were made today, especially from higher ranking administrators and leadership, like leadership matters. and being really vocal about what you care about, and I think declaring where you stand is pretty critical to institutional change. And I think at a point now where, there are institutions, just given the political climate, and I think being in a city where we're experimenting and we understand that we have a population that we have to serve, institutions are kind of under attack in a lot of ways, right? And so how do you kind of revise them? How do you kind of struggle with the legacy of oppression of those actual institutions, right? And how do you have those conversations around all your kind of change agents, right? And also, what's the relearning and the unlearning that has to happen as actual leaders? And I think whenever I'm at the table and I have people who can acknowledge that, that power structure and that paradigm shift that has to happen, that's incredibly powerful, because that's what I start with, period. I'm in the neighborhood with young people who don't leave Brooklyn. They don't leave it, right? We took some young people to Manhattan and they were like, what? What is that, right? And what does that mean, right? What does it mean and what's their perspective, right? So I saw some of the books in the Freedom and Citizenship course, and I was looking at W.E.B. Du Bois, I was looking at Lincoln, and for me, I was like, what were their perspectives on democracy, right? What was education? What were their perspective of who education was for, right? For whom are we talking about? I think that's the work that we're doing here now. And so partnerships to me are not only about, moving young people, low-income youth, first-generation youth, and checking some boxes and feeling good about yourself. It's about, we're talking about equity here, right? And so what's that work gonna look like for the next generation? What are we gonna give up to disrupt the paradigm?
I knew I could count on Lawrence to get in it. Thank you very much. So with that, let's dive deeper into what Lawrence is talking about and what we've heard today. I have a zillion notes here on things that resonated, but from each of you, to me, but that's really not the point. But from each of your perspectives, we've heard from a variety of types of partnerships. We've talked about a variety of needs of young people. We've talked a variety of assets and resources available. From where you sit, not being directly involved in these partnerships to date, what were some of the lessons learned or just ideas or concerns that resonated with you, that came through? Carol, could I start with you?
Sure. Well, I think we all recognize that being successful and graduating from college is a complicated process, and that every student needs supports of all different kinds: financial, academic, social, emotional. And I would like to kind of address the talent thing. We are big supporters of pre-college programs. Skidmore, Syracuse, NYU, Babson, Kenyon, and we're looking for more partners in that area, and we find it incredibly important for young people to have this experience before they go off to college. But almost every single one of those programs still requires a GPA of 85 or above. Some are even higher. And I think if you really have to be a little bit, going back to my point about being flexible, and we have spoken directly with people at the colleges, and particularly if you want to attract young men of color, we try to get students, rising juniors, rather than rising seniors, so that they have some extra time. And this can really help them engage in the college process that they might not have been. And so I think, for instance, we work with Columbia's Lamont Doherty program, and they are the only one that does not have a GPA requirement. And so they are just more open, and I think we have to think about those, how many barriers are we putting on particular programs, even if we think they're helping the cohort of students we want, and to really be careful about how we're looking at that.
So two things that really resonated with me. One was the gentleman from Bard who talked about feeling like you didn't have agency on campus, right? And I think that often happens, and that I think I was in that position as well prior to becoming the dean. And I think what we need to do, whether we're in a college setting or a CBO setting, is we need to find our people. And we need to partner with when we talk about partnerships, we need to partner with our people on campus. And, a couple of examples at Smith, when I became the dean, I felt like it was all about the admission office reaching out to first-generation low-income students and students of color. And you know what? We're just a small piece of that, right? And so what I did was, with a faculty member who was one of my people, I formed a group called the Multicultural Recruitment Working Group. And it was faculty and staff and students all getting together several times a year to talk about how they would, frankly, support me, support the admission office in this very important work that we're doing. And it became a very sort of prestigious group to be a part of, or task force to be a part of. And, you know, the faculty who were on the group talked to their faculty friends. The students who were on the group talked to their student friends. The administrators talked to their administrative friends to talk about the really important work we were doing together. And I think that helped move the conversation along at Smith. Somebody else, maybe it was Dan, who talked about use your platform. This is another thing that resonated with me. I think that's very important because, frankly, I think that admission officers are not doing a good enough job understanding the context of where first-generation low-income kids are coming from. And, you know, one of the things I do is, every national conference, every regional conference, I'm on some kind of a panel that says, I'm at a highly selective small liberal arts college. We are 22% Pell Grant recipients. We are 20% first-generation. And we have students from all over the world. And we are also need-conscious. Right? We meet full demonstrated need, but we're not need blind. We're need conscious. So sometimes ability to pay can factor in whether you're going to be admitted to Smith or not. Nonetheless, we have very high percentage of first generation and low income students because it can be done even in that kind of an environment. Because frankly, there are really only 20 or 25 colleges in the United States that are both need blind and meet full demonstrated need, right? So most of us are need conscious, some gap. That's another issue altogether. But, you got to use your platform off campus, right, in these kinds of experiences as well as on campus to really talk about the importance of these kinds of students on your campus. Because you know what we want, all colleges? We want the best and the brightest students that we can enroll. And you know what? If we are not enrolling first-generation low-income students, we're missing out.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Yeah. Lessons learned, right?
Yep.
I think what Dr. Kendra was talking about when she said you need to be deeply engaged, like we're deeply engaged in the community in K through 12, like that really resonated with me because I feel like that's what CBOs do kind of naturally, and I think because we're talking with principals, we're talking with young people, we're facilitating workshops, we're trying to talk to a provost at a college to try to get some type of relationship started. And I think a lot of times, it's to your point, people don't see the work that's being done by the partner, right? And so I think, and everybody feels kind of by working in silos that, woe is me, I'm so overworked, I'm overwhelmed, why don't they understand us, right? Why don't they understand our demands? Because the institution says the same exact thing, right? We talk to colleges and they're like, I don't get it, like, we're here, you know what I mean? And then we're like, well, are you? You send letters, you send mail. Kids don't open mail. And, and they're like, well, because we don't have a system that's any different. So all these different things are so important to me, this idea of engagement, of just going in the space. I always say, okay, you know what? You want to know about a college? Send an email. Go visit. You don't like that college? How do you know? They're not supporting? Are you sure? Have you spoken to anybody? That school, that's a bad school. We don't want kids from that school. You sure? Go. See if you can actually prove that, right? And this idea of kind of, because I think there's an unlearning that has to happen, but also there has to be an immersion, right? The institutions as we have them they're not functioning the way they're supposed to, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at American democracy right now, it's if you go to a selective college, right, and move probably from a certain zip code, you're gonna make it in America. That's the reality, right? That's pathetic. Right? That's not what it's supposed to be. Now, I'm born and raised in New York City, right? So I know that I have a certain perspective, I have a certain lens. My parents also came from Haiti, so like they had a certain perspective and certain lens when they came in the 70s. So I'm informed by different things, right? But at the same time, we're all informed by different things. So what's your lens and what's your judgment? And when you go to a certain community and say, I don't know about that kid right there. It's to your point. You have to say, that's talent right there. Yeah, maybe you don't have the best GPA, but you figured out a way to get to school every single day, right? When this was happening at home, you didn't have food, right? You didn't have money, but you say, you know what? I'm gonna walk to school. I'm not gonna hop. Maybe you're late, your attendance isn't great, but you walk to school. Constant conversations like that from young people. Put that in your essay. They don't know how to write, right? Can't write. So again, what are we actually looking for, and what's actually gonna be the qualities that are gonna make you survive in a college campus? And who deserves to go there, right? And are we coming up with rubrics and different assessments to be able to say, you know what? Yeah, we're gonna give you a shot. I think that's the biggest lesson learned, is that once you acknowledge that and you do that hard work, now we're moving the needle. Because we're not looking at just the outliers. We have to shift the whole middle at this point of the bell curve.
I'd like to follow up on that, because one of the things that we worry about at Hayden is trying to have this work institutionalized at the higher ed level. Our relationship with Syracuse is a perfect example. Actually, Nancy was at Syracuse when we started working with them, but basically it came from one professor who had this idea, who started this summer program, who does a fabulous job. His friend is in financial aid. I will proudly say that we send 20, 25 students there every year. Syracuse ends up usually recruiting a good 8 or 9 every year, with almost some full packages, others not. But it's not institutionalized. If that professor goes away or the financial aid person leaves, that whole thing will fall apart. And so I loved hearing Dan Porterfield and Nancy, and that double discovery is institutionalized within the university setting. Because I would disagree with Dan a little bit. I do think it has to start at the top.
Yep.
But then, yes, it has to be completely embedded throughout the institution. And then the partnerships are going to work so much better, because it's not dependent upon one person, but several departments and multiple people, and everyone is coming together for the same purpose.
Talk a little further about that, because one of the real true beauties, and I just give enormous thanks for the insight and the dedication, I guess, of the Teagle program, is it's been going on for a significant period of time. And in our marriage between Canva and Brooklyn College, talking about sometimes you need to have that significant time. Partnerships take time to develop. Circumstances change. We have, if it's different federal policies, if it's just different local demographics change. When we talk about sustaining programs, knowing where funds are coming from next year, but knowing who is engaged, and any sort of strategies or thoughts that you've had in each of the places where you sit, where you started to talk, Carol, but also Deb and Lawrence, on how do we actually sustain the work beyond the one good person or the current funding environment which allows it?
Well, I think I'm proud to say that Hayden believes in long-term funding, like obviously Teagle does as well. While we may not make multi-year grants, we typically will stay with grantees for a very long time, sometimes more than 10 years. But within that, we also, and I think it comes back to making sure you have a good relationship and a lot of communication, and being able to go through some of those speed bumps that will come along the way during a program's beginning, middle, and maturity. And I think funders, we do have to be aware of how critically important our funding is to a program, and that those dollars can't be made up easily. I think we get criticized a lot, and rightfully so, for changing our minds about what we're interested in this year. And we used to fund this area, and all of a sudden, well, we're not really doing that anymore, now we're going to do that. So I think it's really incumbent upon funders to be more realistic about what the needs of their grantees are.
Thank you.
It's hard, sustaining these kinds of partnerships, because a lot of times it starts with the relationship between, for instance, an admission officer and the staff at a certain CBO, right? And this admission officer travels to New York every year, and she touches these certain, CBOs, and the relationship develops, and there's a certain amount of trust that develops. In our office, office, what we're trying to do is try to sort of institutionalize these kinds of partnerships by, having this communication with about 450 CBOs, but then saying, we have these 25 who we consider our partners. And what does that mean? When we partner with the CBO, it's sort of, this is what we want to do for you, right? And in helping you to help your students, help us, we want to help you, right? Doing things that we, over and over again, for their students and for their staff. For instance, making sure that every year for our partner CBOs, we make sure that we do a visit when we're in that particular city. We offer essay writing workshops. We offer interview workshops, and we interview students. We offer workshops for CBO staff on understanding how a highly selective college selects students, because we want to be as transparent as possible and as helpful as possible for those CBOs to understand how we're doing the work that we're doing. How can we help you craft a counselor recommendation, right? Because we really encourage our CBO partners to send us sort of in lieu of the public school counselor recommendation, because sometimes public school counselors check the box saying, I don't know the student well enough, so I can't write a recommendation. And so we look to your letters. We welcome your letters. What are we looking for in your letters? Please send us those kinds of letters so that we can understand the context of that student. And as that happens year after year, the partnership develops to the point where if an admission officer leaves or there's change in the agency or the community-based organization, the partnership still exists, right? And so, and it's still strong. But it's not easy.
That's a really good point. I'd say to try to make it happen, one of the things that I really try to figure out is, I always do this thought exercise of like, okay, what if I just moved to Paris tomorrow? What would happen, right? Like, what would happen at work? What would, all my staff always say this, like, oh, you always pick Paris, like, why not another place, right? But it's just an example, right? But do that thought exercise and really think about, like, where do you feel like the pressure points, like, are, right? What are you holding? Why are you holding it? Do you have conditions where you can actually turnkey it, right, and share that? One of the things that we do is when we meet with a partner, we really try to say, this is the work I do, but I'm doing this on behalf of Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, right? So if you do move to Paris or, move on to a different opportunity, that there's still a pathway, right? And still communication. I think the other piece, though, too, I think for it to be sustainable, you have to really have a plan for how you implement change. You have to understand that from the top down. What's your change implementation, like, overview? Like, what's your approach? What's your ED's approach to change? Right? What do they care about? What's your supervisor's approach to change? And really having a clear understanding of how that works, and is that even structured? Because change is, change is the only constancy, right? Like, that's always gonna happen. So you have to account for things are gonna shift, and people are gonna leave, and institutions aren't necessarily gonna have the same type of foundation that they had at one point. But to sustain it, to really understand, like, okay, what is the clear goal and value that we have at the center, and how are we going to keep that constant? I think everybody has to be part of that conversation. And if you don't have those stakeholders, I think it's indicative of the environment that you work in, right? If somebody's like, that's not important to us right now, it's a conversation to have, with your own leadership. Is that the place you want to be? It's a real conversation to have. And I have conversations from when I was a practitioner to now senior management. It's the same thing. This is what I care about. This is what I think our values are. Where do we stand? And every single time it's hard, right? Because they're competing and conflicting priorities, and people think that, we should be doing more of this and we should be doing more of that. We should invest more money here. But at the end of the day, what's our center, right? And can you keep that clear? And I think that's the most important thing, I think, honestly.
Thank you. I was taken with two different points that were made in the president's panel and speaking, and one was just making the case for education and the role that we each have in that. And I think, if I'm, again, preaching to choir here, I think our view of this is for all young people and not just for some. And as we think about, another discussion was that creating the interdependence, which I thought was actually really a lovely way of thinking about how we embed, that in effect we can't do any of our work by ourselves if we actually want young people to be successful. So as we use that as sort of a framework, give me some thoughts on that. in each of your institutions, who needs to be part of those discussions? How do we have those discussions to think about how we can collectively both make the case for education, but create that interdependence which allows us to then achieve education?
Well, I can start. At a place like Smith, you better have faculty buy-in, right? At its most basic level, my job is to put students in the classroom to keep the faculty happy, or I'll be fired, right? It's 23 years, I'm doing okay so far. But that, I think, is really important, because especially if we're talking about first-generation low-income students who are coming from under-resourced high school, the fact of the matter is their preparation is often weak, right? So they're very smart, but their prep is weak. And so in the admission process, you're looking at both preparedness and potential, right? Because the fact of the matter is, once those first-gen kids are on our campus for a year, they explode, right? I mean, that first year is a huge learning curve, but then they're, wow. And the faculty need to be ready to support them, understanding that they're worth the effort in terms of sort of support in writing, support sometimes in quantitative skills, right? And I will say, at Smith, there's the faculty buy-in. And so that makes my job 100% easier, right? Because they appreciate those students and they know that their role as a faculty member has changed in the last 20 years because the students who they're serving have changed.
Thank you.
I think from my perspective, and I'm a firm believer in the liberal arts education, and in fact we have 2 Vassar alums sitting at the table there. Oh, another one. But I think sometimes it comes around language, and so what I would love to see is us switch to career and college skills and talk about that those skills are really the same, because I think there's still a polarization about who's going to go to the top 4, who should be going, who is eligible for a top 4-year college, and then, well, we have all these other kids who are going to community college. And the reality is that every young person is going to need some post-secondary education. And I think if we start talking about college and career ready, then we're not going to say liberal arts is no longer necessary. It doesn't fit. I'm not going to send my kid to a liberal arts college because they have to have a skill like become an accountant, and Vassar doesn't have an accounting course. And so I think some of this has to be about expanding how we look at post-secondary education and not making it so siloed as it has been, but really talking about it in terms of skill building, and that every young person is capable of learning if they have the proper preparation, the proper supports, and access to a variety of programs throughout the course of their education.
Can I just follow up on one of the points you made? And that is, I think that at least the selective liberal arts colleges there's a certain snobbery about community colleges, and we really need to change that because that is such a common pathway for first-generation students. And I think, I'd like to think that Smith is a place that's transfer-friendly from the community. We actively recruit at community colleges throughout the country. The students in our non-traditional program, 90% of them come from community colleges. Our traditional age transfers, probably 30% come from community colleges. They enrich our campus in a way I can't even tell you. They're our biggest cheerleaders. They are incredibly grateful, so hardworking, so happy to be there, and they come well prepared. But I think that we also, use your platform. I'm trying to use my platform to make sure that the selective colleges understand transfers are not an afterthought. And community college transfers are competitive for admission and do wonderful work. I feel like I'm yelling. Do wonderful work at places like Smith.
Are you familiar with America Achieves? Okay.
100%. I mean, ditto. I think, just thinking about transfer work, we have such a big population of students at community college. So this idea of like intentional transfer, the kind of new access, as it were, of, transfer work, because not only are they afterthought, but they're also like they're invisible in data, right? Like there's not even good data on transfer students. That's ridiculous, right? You would think an institution, right, that would be like one of the first things that they would do. Even at the Fed level, that's something you would want to know. But because, again, there's a certain profile of what transfer students are and how self-sufficient they are and where their soft skills should be, that it doesn't matter, they'll be all right. And, you know, the data that we do have shows the contrary. But I think also just in terms of institutions and kind of how they approach their leadership, I think it's exactly this, right? Like, what are people even thinking about in the first place?
No.
Oh.
I'm just looking at time.
Oh, okay, time, yeah.
No.
What are things that we're even thinking about in the first place? And I think that's where it kind of starts. That's where the conversation is. If you're not even considering where young people are coming from, why their communities are the way they were in the first place, right? That there's nothing defective about a young person that comes from a low-income community, right? I think that's really important because a lot of times, and I've heard this from, you know, administrators, I've heard this even from principals, right? They'll just go to community college, probably, whatever, right? And that's the potential. That's where the bar is set. So what does that mean about us as the responsible adults in their lives who are supposed to make the recommendations to get them through, right? What's our judgment? What are our blind spots? Nobody's exempt, right? And so we have to really have conversations about that and incorporate that in how we lead. I think that's at all levels. I think whether you're a funder, I think whether you're, you know, leadership in an institution or whether you're a CBO and you have a bunch of staff that you have to manage, or you have a caseload of 50, 60 kids, right? And you have all these competing, you know, things that are happening, and you have to actually get boxes checked. But I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
So I have one more question. I think we'll have time for maybe 2 questions from the audience. So if you have one, let me know. So Lawrence, when you're talking, actually one thing sort of comes to mind, and that's in part some of the folks who aren't at the table right now, but also include data and information that exists in each of the 3 sets of institutions you're representing here, but don't necessarily exist among us, so something to think about. So Deb, you talking about transfer students from community colleges, that would really build a lot of the, you know, the data that you have around that could be really powerful with both foundations and with practitioners and understanding how do we guide students. Look, this actually is a good thing. It is a pathway, and how we make those more explicit. But I wonder if each of you could speak just briefly about the thoughts on how we also get this information to families. And often it can be a real challenge to think about the investment in college, both in terms of time and potential lost wages for families that have been depending on their high school students helping earn, but as well as then connecting it to the career issue, and that it feels better sometimes to say, look, he's got a job. How do we take all of this knowledge and also allow families to enter this conversation in a deeper way?
I would say that is the role of the CBOs. And that's one of the strongest ways that they can help young people, and they do engage the families. And I think they do it in a much better way than most public, parochial, or independent schools. They are friendly, they are welcoming, and we've heard stories that somebody was saying, oh, the 2 Muslim girls that weren't going to be allowed to go to Skidmore. Well, if it hadn't been for the SEO staff, who knows the family, who the first time those children start working with SEO, they have the families in, and they maintain relationships and develop relationships with the families. And that's how they're able then to provide a really great pathway for young people. I think that's one of the most brilliant things about CBO partnerships.
Thank you.
I agree. And I think admission officers are way deficient in this area, because I will say, especially at the selective colleges, guess what we're always saying? Back off, back off, back off. It's your child needs to drive the bus, or whatever metaphor you want to use about the whole college process. And depending on the group, we're very careful depending on the audience, whether we sort of ask the parents to lean in or back off. And I think we need to do a better job of welcoming parents into the process. And one of the ways that we do it, this will sound a little cheesy, but one of the ways that we do it at Smith is we ask for a parent recommendation. It's optional, but, you know, we want to hear, you've spent 17 years raising this kid. You know, you probably have some insights that nobody else has about her. We welcome them in other languages. There have been times when a father drove 2 hours and said, I have to meet with the dean, you know, and why does he have to meet with the dean? Everybody wants to meet with me because my name's on everything, but, you know, have to meet with her, and I went downstairs and I said, you know, well, what do you need? And he said, you asked for this parent recommendation and I don't write in English. I'm going to talk it to you. And, you know, but I need more vehicles for that, right? To ask those parents to really lean into the process, because if they don't trust us, the colleges, they're not sending their young women, well, they're, you know, whatever, if whatever the institution, their young sons and daughters to us, because they need to trust. And we need to do a better job of building that trust with them.
I'm going to make her feel better. This is a story about Smith, but also about how the CBO partnership works. There's an organization called Row New York, and there was a young woman who was accepted to Smith, and something happened with her mother, of course, the summer before she's going to start, and she said, I'm not going to go. So the Row New York staff met with her, met with the mother, you know, convinced her to go, and then called Smith and talked. At that point, I would say there's sometimes a disconnect between admissions, and then once the student's admitted, admissions sort of like disappears, and they don't know what happens to that student. But since the student hadn't arrived on campus, the staff person from New York spoke to someone in the admissions office who made sure that everything was in place for that young woman.
Go Deb.
I mean, I think parent engagement, family engagement is like incredibly difficult, just in general. Anybody who works at a DOE know this is super duper hard. Anybody who's worked at a school knows how hard it is to engage parents. But it's also because I think it's funny, like the way that people communicate, it's like 19th century like style communication with parents, right? It's like, we're gonna do this thing for families at 2 p.m. They're not working, right? We're gonna do it at 7. That's totally gonna have great attendance, right? And I think it's one kind of revising, how do we do outreach, you know, to parents, and also engaging them. I think it's totally fine to say like, hey, our school's open, just have an open school, you know what I mean, like time, right? And just have parents just be able to set up appointments and just walk in and get information about, hey, I don't really know a lot about college, I hear about it, what is it, you know? And so I think also the fact that there's a lot of competing information. So, you know, I don't know if anybody's representing for-profit institutions, but I'm not a fan of you. And so I'm going to say that very, very, very clearly. And so, but the one thing that for-profit institutions have done incredibly well is access. Anybody who's taken, I don't know if you're familiar with Broadway Junction, right? But Broadway Junction, right, is a massive hub, right? And guess who's there? You don't see BMCC over there. You don't see Brooklyn College, you know, shout out to Brooklyn College. Guess who's there? The for-profit schools and the military, right? That works. And I've engaged with them. I say, hey, let me talk to you real quick. So this is what I do. What are you doing? And they say, well, you know, I'm here for this time to this time, and I'm trying to recruit for these programs. And I'm thinking, I'm like, they're not only engaging young people on their way to school or just going to work, they're engaging parents, right, and families. We're gonna go back to their neighborhoods, right? And they're gonna say, you know what? That program, you can get it in 18 months. You should go.
And get a job.
And get a job right after. Who wouldn't do that? It's amazing. I'm totally gonna sign up my kid for that. And it's free.
With federal money.
Oh my goodness. Right? I feel like I wanna sign up my child right now, right? That's not what we do though in any other institution where young people would get this type of support that we know would move the needle. So I think, you know, I totally hear that, yes, CBOs, I think, definitely have a critical role in engaging families, but I think you can come up with some, new innovative strategies to go to people's neighborhoods. And it's interesting, you know, Hot 97 and 105.1, they always have street teams. I don't know if you see people with, like, vitamin water and stuff, like the little energy drinks. You ever notice that? When I was a kid, I would always, like, see them. I'm like, what are you doing? But there was tons of them. Now, different budgets, you can do that with your marketing strategy, right? But what if schools did that? And you just went and said, hey, look, I'm gonna go into this neighborhood that this zip code seems to have this type of college readiness index. we're going to go and talk to some families and tell them about the school and see what programs we can actually, offer to their young people and how financial aid works and how PLUS loans are bad, right? I don't know. Maybe just a thought.
Well, I am going to renege on my offer of questions and answers, but with that, I am...
Fern has one. Yeah, Fern has one for you.
Got you.
Quick. All right. Fern.
There was a model program developed in the boarding community college many years ago called Exploring Transfer.
Yep.
There is a book written by Dr. Janet Beaton about Exploring Transfer.
Yes.
Where the Warrior partnered with Vassar
Yes.
and many other colleges.
Yes.
So just wanted to share.
Thanks,
Thank-
Fern. It's a great program.
Thank you. I am taken by what is both been an extraordinary, informative, and interesting, and just resource-rich and intellectually stimulating day. But I'm also taken with the real call to action, I think, that we all have. And that there is a role for all of us, no matter where we sit, and for folks who aren't necessarily directly in the room, including young people right now, in ways that we can make this better, that we can create pathways that work for diverse students, and by that I mean people coming from a whole lot of different perspectives and interests and backgrounds, and bringing the richness of that experience to institutions at every level, which will help all of the academic as well as the life outcomes for young people. So I thank the panelists for representing so beautifully all of the different pieces.